Water test. In medieval times, torture to prove accusations of witchcraft was a very common practice, particularly during the period of the Church's Inquisition in Europe. The practice reached its peak between the 15th and 17th centuries, where water testing, or severe trials, were used to determine whether someone was a witch. These trials often led to suffering or death for the victim, with little or no legal defense. Water tests are conducted in a very brutal manner. People accused of being witches, generally women, are tied up and thrown into water. It was assumed that if a person was a witch, they would not drown due to a pact with the devil, and their bodies were thought not to accept natural elements such as water. If the victim floats, they are considered guilty and will be put to death, usually by burning alive or hanging. However, if the victim drowned, although often to death by drowning or injury, they were considered innocent, but the punishment was too late, as they were already dead. The Spanish Inquisition, led by Tomás de Torquemada, a Dominican, was notorious for using torture methods to force confessions from accused witches. In many cases, further physical torture was applied after the water test to ensure confessions from revealed witches. These experiments were part of a witch hunt that saw thousands of people, mainly women, killed across Europe. At its peak, The Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, a guidebook published in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, suggested various ways to identify witches, including testing with water. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, more than 100,000 people were put to death for witchcraft accusations in Europe. These tests were not only cruel, but also unscientific and strongly reflected the era's ignorance of human rights and due process. Alchemy Experiment. The alchemy experiment in the Middle Ages was a series of experiments conducted by alchemists who tried to turn common metals into gold or find the philosopher's stone that was believed to grant immortality. The practice of alchemy took place in Europe, the Middle East, and India, starting in the 12th century and continuing until the 16th century. Although alchemy cannot be considered a legitimate science by modern standards, alchemical experiments played an important role in developing several branches of science, such as chemistry, pharmacy, and metallurgy. Alchemists believed that they could find ways to transmute common metals, such as tin or copper, into gold through complex chemical processes. One of their main goals was to find the philosopher's stone, a substance that could accelerate this transmutation, in addition to being believed to have the ability to grant eternal life or cure all diseases. The alchemical process was secretive and full of symbolism, and alchemists often worked in laboratories full of dangerous chemicals, even though they didn't fully understand the dangers. Some of the alchemical experiments conducted often involved the use of extremely dangerous chemicals such as mercury, arsenic, and sulfur, which are known to have deadly toxic effects. In their search for the lucky stone, alchemists spent years experimenting with heating, mixing, and often high-risk chemical processes, without a clear understanding of the reactions taking place. Many alchemists died or were injured due to poisoning or accidents from explosions or fires. Although alchemical experiments were ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their goals, some of their results, such as the discovery of sulfuric acid and the development of distillation techniques, paved the way for more modern scientific discoveries. However, the alchemists themselves were unable to turn metals into gold as they had hoped. These risky alchemical experiments reflect mankind's relentless quest to understand the world and master the universe, albeit often in very dangerous and unscientific ways. Anatomy Experiment. The Anatomy Experiment by Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century is an important milestone in the history of medicine, although the experiments he conducted were often highly controversial and cruel by modern ethical standards. Vesalius, a Belgian scientist and physician, is known as a pioneer in studying the anatomy of the human body through deep dissection. Before Vesalius, the understanding of the anatomy of the human body was based on the writings of Galen, a Greco-Roman physician, which were mostly derived from observations on the bodies of animals and not humans. Vesalius wanted to correct the errors in the understanding of anatomy based on Galen's theories, and to do so, He performed live dissections of the human body to study the organs and systems of the body. At that time, autopsy or dissection of the human body was not only illegal, but also taboo, especially under the influence of the Catholic Church, which forbade the exhumation or opening of the human body. However, Vesalius overcame this by stealing corpses or acquiring bodies from people condemned to death. He conducted anatomical experiments carefully and meticulously, opening up the human body to see more clearly how the organs worked in the body. One of his most famous works is De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, a monumental book that describes in detail the structure of the human body with highly detailed and accurate illustrations. This book changed the way people viewed the human body and laid the foundation for modern anatomy. However, these experiments were conducted without the use of anesthesia or medical techniques as we know them today, so the dissection and surgery procedures were extremely painful for the individuals. In addition, there was no medical care or ethical oversight of the bodies used in the dissection. Thanks to his hard work, Vesalius revealed many errors in Galen's theory, such as an incorrect understanding of blood circulation and the structure of certain organs. However, his experiments were still extremely cruel by today's ethical standards, given his disregard for human dignity and rights. Nonetheless, his contributions to science were significant and paved the way for further developments in medicine and anatomy. Healing with poisons. The healing with poisons experiments conducted by scientists in the 16th to 17th centuries are among the most dangerous and extreme medical experiments in the history of science. At this time, medicine and medical knowledge were still very limited, and many doctors or healers tried to treat various diseases in untested ways and sometimes using toxic materials. One of the most gruesome experiments was the use of poisons to test the effects on human and animal bodies. Scientists, especially alchemists and doctors of the time, often conducted experiments using toxic materials such as arsenic, mercury, and sulfur to try to find ways to treat diseases or to test theories about how poisons affect the body. They believed that by understanding the effects of these poisons, they could find more effective antidotes or treatment methods. These experiments were often conducted on prisoners sentenced to death or people who were already in critical condition. One famous example is the experiments conducted by Dr. Giovanni Maria Lancisi, a physician from the Vatican in the 17th century. Lancisi conducted experiments to observe the effects of poisons on the human body by injecting or administering poisons to patients who were already sick to see how their bodies reacted. However, these treatments often ended in the death of the patient, given that the poisons used were very dangerous and there was no knowledge of how to prevent poisoning. In addition, there were also experiments conducted by doctors such as Paracelsus, a famous alchemist, who argued that all chemicals are poison, but the right dose can make them medicine. This view encouraged experimentation with small doses of various harmful chemicals, which was sometimes successful for some ailments, but often fatal because there was not yet an adequate understanding of how the body reacts to such chemicals. Mercury, for example, is used in many medicines, even though we now know that it is highly toxic to the human body. These experiments were conducted in an attempt to find treatments for various diseases, such as malaria, syphilis, and even the flu, but without proper knowledge of the toxins and their effects on the body, the results were often very damaging. Many people fell victim to these experiments, and a large number of patients died as a result of poisoning or side effects from the harmful chemicals used in the treatment. Ultimately, these kinds of experiments contributed little to the medical knowledge of the time, but it was only through growing scientific conversations and more careful experimentation that the medical world finally began to understand the importance of more controlled and safe testing and was open to the development of more effective treatments in the future. However, back then, these experiments were part of a very risky and gruesome quest for knowledge. War casualties. Wound healing experiments on war casualties by medieval scientists is one of the gruesome aspects of medical experiments in the medieval era. In those days, medical care was very limited, especially for soldiers wounded in war. Medieval scientists, healers, and doctors tried various techniques to treat physical wounds from war, albeit without an adequate understanding of infection or antiseptics. Many of these experiments were conducted in very primitive and sometimes dangerous ways given the lack of knowledge about the anatomy of the human body and how the immune system works. In medieval times, wounds from war were often very severe, with victims sustaining broken bones, open wounds, and internal organ injuries. In an attempt to heal these wounds, doctors resorted to cruel treatment practices, such as washing wounds with alcohol, using chemical-based ointments that were often harmful, and even cutting off infected body parts without the use of anesthesia or sterilization techniques. One of the most common practices was burning wounds to stop bleeding or treat infection. Although we now know that cauterizing wounds is a very poor and ineffective method, in those days many doctors and healers believed that fire could kill toxins or speed up healing. In fact, some doctors believed that fire could cleanse wounds, which in reality caused more damage and infection. In addition, some medieval doctors tried to use very dangerous medicinal herbs, often containing toxic chemicals such as mercury or arsenic. Their aim was to kill toxins present in the body or reduce inflammation, although these ingredients more often harmed patients than cured them. For example, arsenic-based ointments are often applied to wounds to reduce swelling or treat skin disorders, but arsenic is a highly dangerous poison to the human body. Surgical methods were also practiced in an attempt to treat war wounds. However, in those days there was no understanding of infection or sterilization, so the surgical tools used were often contaminated and caused severe infections. Even when patients survived surgery, many later died from infection or other complications. One particularly dangerous experiment is trying to remove toxins or diseases from a patient's body in extreme ways, such as by suctioning blood or performing suction cures, using non-standardized and often contaminated instruments. This technique, despite being a dismal failure and often dangerous, was used in medical experiments for several centuries. Overall, medical experiments on medieval war dead were a far cry from the medical standards we are familiar with today. Many of these procedures were not only ineffective, but added to the patient's suffering and caused needless deaths. The suffering of war wounds, coupled with scientific ignorance about infection and treatment, made these experiments particularly gruesome. It wasn't until the discovery of antiseptic knowledge, anesthesia, and an understanding of infection in the 19th century that safer and more effective medical treatments were introduced. Mad blood transfusion. The healing with blood experiment in the 16th century was one of the most bizarre and gruesome medical experiments conducted at the time. One of the most famous experiments was the blood transfusion, which was initially performed without sufficient understanding of blood circulation, or even compatibility between human and animal blood. The initial goal of these experiments was to cure diseases or provide other medical benefits through blood transfusions, certainly without modern knowledge of the immune system or the risk of the body rejecting foreign blood. In those days, scientists, especially in Europe, often tested blood transfusions as a way to cure various ailments, including melancholia, mental illness, or even lack of energy that was considered a symptom of physical illness. They assumed that blood could revive a weakened person or provide strength from younger, healthier blood. For example, Jean-Baptiste Denis, a French physician, conducted several blood transfusion experiments on animals, which were later conducted on humans. These experiments often involved transfusing blood from sheep or cows into humans, which was often fatal as the human body cannot accept blood from animals. In 1667, Denis performed the first recorded blood transfusion between a human and an animal. He transfused sheep's blood into a sick man. At first, the man seemed to show improvement, but then suffered severe side effects, such as fever, convulsions, and eventually death. However, despite this experiment failing and causing death, similar experiments continued to be conducted by other doctors, as their understanding of the blood circulation system was very limited. They did not know about the concept of blood groups or the importance of blood compatibility between donor and recipient. Blood transfusions with human-to-human blood were also attempted, but without the knowledge of disease transmission, resulting in infection or even death. Doctors like Richard Lower, a British scientist, conducted blood transfusion experiments with human blood, but the results were often fatal. One famous experiment was his animal experiments, such as passing blood between dogs, which gave some understanding of how the circulatory system works, but not enough to ensure successful transfusion in humans. In these experiments, no anesthesia was used, so the patients involved suffered immense pain during these highly invasive procedures. In addition, there was no understanding at all of the risks of infectious diseases, so blood transfusions performed at the time could potentially carry diseases such as hepatitis, HIV, or tuberculosis, which could be transmitted through unfiltered blood. Although the blood transfusion experiments at the time seemed to be riddled with medical errors, they provided a fundamental understanding that was crucial to the development of modern blood transfusion. The discovery of blood groups by Karl Landsteiner in 1900 and the understanding of blood compatibility eventually allowed blood transfusions to be safe and effective in modern medicine. However, during the 16th and 17th centuries, blood transfusion experiments did more harm than good, often resulting in death or permanent damage to the patient's body. These experiments, though fraught with failure, showed how much people at the time were trying to understand the human body and find ways to treat diseases that they could not yet explain scientifically. However, medieval experiments with blood are another example of a very risky and gruesome quest for knowledge, without sufficient basis in medical knowledge. Bloodletting. Bloodletting was a very common method of treatment in medieval times, although it proved to be extremely dangerous and ineffective. The practice was performed with the aim of removing dirty blood from the body, which was believed to reduce inflammation and restore the balance of the body's humor. The ancient medical concept that the human body is made up of 4 basic fluids: blood, mucus, black bile, and yellow bile. An imbalance between these fluids was thought to be the main cause of disease, and one way to correct this was to bleed. The bloodletting method involves opening a blood vessel, usually a vein, to remove a certain amount of blood from the body. This is done using various tools, such as scalpels, lancets, or even special cups that use a vacuum to pull the blood out of the body. In addition, hirudotherapy is sometimes used, which involves using leeches to suck blood. This practice was very popular in Europe and the Middle East during medieval times and even lasted until the early 19th century. One of the reasons why bloodletting was so common was that many doctors still relied on the humoral theory from ancient Greek times, which was carried forward by Galen, a Roman physician. Galen believed that removing blood from the body would restore fluid balance and, thus, cure diseases. In medieval times, a large number of illnesses were considered to be the result of excess blood, which was believed to cause fever, headaches, and various other disorders. For example, people experiencing fever or influenza would often be prescribed to have their blood removed, hoping that this would alleviate the symptoms. Even patients with more serious conditions, such as tuberculosis or epilepsy, were sometimes treated with bloodletting. This practice is carried out by doctors or healers who believe that the expelled blood will cleanse the body of the disease. However, while many believe that bloodletting can cure diseases, in reality, this method often causes further damage. Removing large amounts of blood can lead to anemia, shock, or even death, especially in patients who are already weak or malnourished. In many cases, this process not only fails to cure the disease, but actually worsens the patient's condition. Experiments with bloodletting were very common among kings and nobles, who were often treated by their personal physicians. For example, during the reign of George III of England, the king was treated with bloodletting in an attempt to treat the symptoms of his mental disorder, which is now believed to be caused by porphyria, a condition that affects hemimetabolism. Despite medical attempts to cure him by bleeding him out, the treatment was unsuccessful and caused more suffering. One of the most famous examples of a major mistake in bloodletting is the case of George Washington, the first president of the United States. When Washington suffered from a severe sore throat in 1799, his doctors performed bloodletting by removing about 1.5 liters of blood from his body. This was a move that not only failed to treat his illness, but most likely contributed to the death of Washington, who died shortly after the treatment. Bloodletting only began to be abandoned after the discovery of the germ theory of disease and a better understanding of blood circulation by William Harvey in the 17th century. Harvey, an English physiologist, proved that blood circulates in a closed system and does not have to be removed from the body to cure disease. Although bloodletting is now considered a highly dangerous and unscientific medical practice, experiments with this technique show how far humans have come in their quest to understand and cure disease, albeit often through methods that are not based on proper scientific evidence. This practice provides an important lesson in scientific courage that dares to take great risks in the pursuit of knowledge, albeit often at a very high price. Zombie making. The zombie-making experiment was one of the darkest and most gruesome experiments conducted in the medieval era, although most cannot be considered a scientific experiment in the modern sense. The practice relates to beliefs in temporary death, reanimation, and zombies, often associated with black rituals or voodoo practices used by certain groups. In medieval times, various peoples, including Europeans and Africans, believed that through the use of certain poisons or compounds, a person could be put into a coma or temporarily die, which could then be used to control them or bring them back to life. Such experiments are often conducted using plant-based poisons or chemicals that can degrade the body systems to near-death levels, with potentially fatal side effects if not done carefully. One of the most famous examples is experiments with tetrodotoxin-based poisons, a chemical found in fugu, pufferfish, which can cause temporary death by slowing the heartbeat and stopping breathing. In the 17th century, some witches in Haiti and other Caribbean regions were known for using this poison to create zombies, a person who appears to be dead, but are then resurrected and controlled by their rulers. There are historical records of individuals being used as slaves or tools in various rituals, which they thought could bring life back to the victim. In Europe, similar experiments with plant poisons were also used by healers and magic practitioners, who believed they could control life and death. One ingredient often used was belladonna, which has a hallucinogenic effect and can decrease bodily functions to the point of temporary death. This poison is often used in an attempt to make someone appear dead and then resurrect them in a controlled state. Additionally, in some regions, especially in medieval and early modern times, there were attempts to use concocted poisons to cure illnesses, albeit without proper scientific understanding. This practice was often practiced on those who were considered witches, as they were thought to have knowledge of the dangerous and forbidden secrets of nature. If the experiment fails, or the poison is not properly removed from the body, it often leads to fatal poisoning. Although zombies in this context are often understood more as social control or power than supernatural phenomena, such experiments demonstrate an extreme desire to control life and create the illusion of resurrection. It also reflects how far individuals of the era would go to explore the limits of nature and their power, albeit often at a very high cost in terms of human lives. Ultimately, these kinds of experiments also illustrate a very dark and superstitious worldview, where the line between life and death was very blurred, and science and medicine were still hindered by mystical beliefs and the desire for power. Most of these experiments, while interesting in a historical and anthropological context, made no meaningful contribution to scientific or medical knowledge, and more often than not, caused unnecessary death or suffering. Galen. Galen, a physician and scientist from the 2nd century AD, conducted experiments that were highly influential in developing an understanding of the nervous system, although many of his theories were erroneous. As an influential medical school, he conducted experiments by cutting or damaging nerves in the animals he dissected, mainly monkeys and pigs, due to the prohibition of human dissection at the time. One of his most famous experiments was when he cut the spinal nerves in animals and observed the impact on body movement. Galen concluded that nerves connect the brain to the limbs, and damage to the spinal nerves can lead to loss of movement ability in the connected body parts. He also conducted experiments on the optic nerve, cutting it and finding that the animal lost vision, which corroborated his understanding that the optic nerve plays a role in vision. However, despite his groundbreaking experiments, Galen was still stuck in a misconception about the brain and nervous system. He thought that the brain functioned to cool the blood and control the body through the spirit flowing in the nerves, a mistaken view. In fact, he still held the theory that the heart is the center of feeling and intellect, not the brain. Nonetheless, Galen's observations on the anatomy and functionality of the nervous system remained an important foundation in medical science and anatomy for centuries. His thoughts and experiments endured as a major influence in medicine until the Renaissance, although many of his theories were later refuted. Galen's legacy remains instrumental in the transition from ancient beliefs to more modern medical understanding.